The day Isaiah Wells rode onto the Carver property, the sky above the Texas panhandle was the color of old bone, and the earth beneath his horse's hooves cracked like a shattered mirror as far as the eye could see. Rebecca Carver was standing on the porch of her farmhouse when she first spotted him, a lone figure cutting across the flat, sun-scorched land from the direction of Holt Creek, trailing a small column of dust behind him like a signature. She had been expecting someone like him for weeks now, ever since she had started hearing rumors in town about the Caldwell Land Company sending out riders to speak with struggling ranchers and farmers about selling their holdings. The drought had been vicious and unrelenting since the spring of 1886, and the Texas Panhandle had taken a beating unlike anything the old-timers could remember. Wells had dried up. Cattle had dropped where they stood. Corn had turned to straw before it ever reached a foot high. Rebecca had watched her neighbors one by one pack their wagons and move east, their properties gobbled up by buyers who swooped in like vultures the moment the signatures were dry. She wiped her hands on her apron and squared her shoulders. She was 26 years old, the sole owner of the Carver land since her father had passed the previous winter, and she had no intention of becoming another name on a deed transfer filed in the Amarillo courthouse. The 480 acres of the Carver spread might be parched and struggling, but it was hers. Every fence post, every rotting barn beam, every cracked trough, all of it was hers, and she planned to keep it that way. The rider came through the front gate, a wooden thing hanging crookedly on its post, and she got her first clear look at him as he pulled his horse to a stop in the yard. He was younger than she had expected. Most of the men the land companies sent were gray-haired and dressed in the kind of suits that said money without shouting it. This man was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, with dark hair and the kind of sunburned, weathered face that came from spending a great deal of time outdoors rather than behind a desk. He wore a plain working man's coat and a battered hat, and he sat his horse with the easy, unconscious balance of someone who had grown up in the saddle. He was not dressed like a land agent at all. He touched the brim of his hat when he saw her on the porch. "Ma'am, I am looking for the owner of the Carver property, Rebecca Carver, if I have the right place." "You have the right place," she said evenly. "I am Rebecca Carver. Who are you?" "Isaiah Wells." He swung down from his horse, a solid bay mare that looked as tired as the rest of the landscape, and looped the reins over the gate post. He did not come up onto the porch but stood at the foot of the steps, hat in his hands now, which she noted was either a gesture of genuine respect or a practiced move of men who wanted to seem that way. "I was sent out by the Caldwell Land Company out of Amarillo. I have been authorized to make you an offer on the property." There it was. She had known it from the moment she saw him coming, and still hearing the words spoken plainly in the dry air made something tighten in her chest. "You have ridden a long way for nothing, Mr. Wells," she said. "I am not selling." He looked at her for a moment, and she expected the practiced patience of a man who had been told no before and planned to outlast it with numbers and logic. Instead, something passed across his face that she could not quite read. It was not frustration. It was something more complicated. "I have heard that before," he said. "Would you at least hear the offer?" "I know what the offer will be," she said. "It will be exactly enough to make a woman in my situation feel grateful and not quite enough to make her feel she got what her land is worth. And it will come with very sympathetic words about the drought and how difficult things must be, and then there will be paperwork." His mouth curved at one corner, not quite a smile but close. "You have done this before. My neighbor Mrs. Prout did it last month." She described it in some detail. He stood there in the yard for a moment, looking out at the land around the house, and then he surprised her. He did not launch into his pitch. He just looked. He looked at the dry fields, at the bare kitchen garden she had tried to keep alive with bucket water hauled from the cistern, at the sagging barn out to the east, at the line of dead cottonwoods along what had been a creek bed. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at something that troubles him, not the way a buyer looks at an acquisition. "Miss Carver," he said, and then he paused. "When is the last time you had water in that creek?" The question surprised her. "April," she said. "Early April." It slowed to nothing in May. He nodded slowly. And the well, still giving barely enough for the house and a few animals. She crossed her arms. Why do you ask? You are not buying the water rights separately if that is what you are thinking. I am not thinking that, he said. He set his hat back on his head and looked at her directly. May I be honest with you, Miss Carver? I would prefer it. I have been riding this territory for 3 weeks, he said. I have made offers on 11 properties. 7 have sold. 3 told me no and sent me on my way, and I filed my report and moved along. You are the last name on my list. He paused. I am going to tell you something I have not told the others, which is that I am not entirely sure the work I have been doing is good work. She stared at him. That was not what land agents said. Land agents talked about the market value of land and the company's genuine interest in fair dealing. They did not stand in your yard looking troubled and say they were not sure their work was good. Then why are you doing it? She asked. I needed the employment, he said simply. I am not proud of that answer, but it is the honest one. He looked away from her and back at the cracked earth of the yard. My grandfather lost his farm in Georgia when I was 7 years old. I remember what it looked like, a man standing in a yard that used to mean everything to him, watching strangers measure it out. He cleared his throat. I have been trying not to think about that for 3 weeks. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. She had been prepared for an adversary. She was not entirely sure what to do with this. Come up out of the sun, Mr. Wells, she said finally. I will give you some water and you can tell me whatever else you came to say. He looked momentarily startled, as though he had not expected that. Then he nodded and climbed the porch steps, and she went inside to fetch the water pitcher. She brought out 2 tin cups and poured them both. He sat on the old wooden bench along the porch rail, looking out across the land again, and she sat in her chair and watched him. Up close she could see that he was tired in the way of someone who had been working against his conscience for too long. There was something honest in that tiredness that she found herself responding to despite every instinct that told her to keep this man at arm's length. So tell me, she said. You came to buy me out. You know the offer. I have told you I am not selling. What else is there to say? He turned his cup in his hands. I did not come here only to buy you out, he said. I told you I would be honest. The honest version is that I came because I had a job to do. But I have been sitting on the road thinking about what I was riding toward for the last 2 hours, and I think the reason I kept stopping and then making myself go on is that I do not actually want to do this job on this particular piece of land. Because of your grandfather, partly, he said. He looked at her. And partly because I have been in this territory long enough to see what is happening. The Caldwell Company is not buying land to ranch it or farm it. They are banking it, sitting on it until the drought breaks and the value comes back, and then reselling at 3 and 4 times what they paid for it. The people they are buying from will come back in 5 years and find they cannot afford to repurchase what their families built. Rebecca felt the truth of that settle in her stomach like a stone. She had suspected it, but hearing it laid out plainly was different. Then what do you suggest, Mr. Wells? She said. Because the drought is real and my situation is real and I cannot run cattle or grow crops on dust. I know, he said, and I do not have a clean answer for you. I just could not ride up here and pretend to be only what I told you I was. He finished his water and set the cup down. He did not reach for any papers. He did not pull out a contract or quote her a price. He just sat on her porch in the late afternoon heat and looked like a man who had ridden into something he was still trying to understand. You should stay for supper, she said, and she surprised herself with the words almost as much as she could see she surprised him. Miss Carver, I have salt pork and cornbread, and it is not much, but it is more than you will find before Holt Creek, she said, and I think you have something more to tell me that you have not gotten to yet. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, steady eyes. Yes, he said quietly, I think I do. She fed him supper at the small table in the kitchen, the one her father had built the year before she was born with planks hauled by wagon from Amarillo. She told him that as she set the food out, not because she expected him to care, but because she needed him to understand that every object in this house had a story attached to it that was part of her. He listened without interrupting, which was more than most men did. "Your father built a good table," he said, running one hand along the edge of it. "Good joinery, he knew what he was doing. He was a carpenter before he was a rancher," she said. "He came out here in 1869, built this house himself, and spent the rest of his life arguing with the land about who was in charge." She smiled at the memory, and it hurt in the familiar way old grief could hurt, softly and without warning. "He never won the argument, but he never conceded either. He sounds like he was a good man." "He was the best man I knew," she said. "He died last December, pneumonia. The winter was bad, and he would not slow down enough to let himself get better." She looked down at her plate. "He left me this land and told me to hold on to it." Isaiah Wells was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry about your father," he said, and it was not the automatic politeness of those words when people use them without thinking. He said it like he meant it, slowly, as though he had considered whether to say it and decided the truth was worth the saying. "You said at supper you had something more to tell me," Rebecca said when the meal was done and she had poured them each a cup of coffee. "I am still waiting for it." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the surface of the liquid as though it might tell him something useful. "There is a reason the Caldwell Company is moving fast on these properties," he said. "There is a route survey happening, a railroad spur. If it goes through the panhandle as the planners want it to, it will come within 6 miles of this land, possibly closer. Land with railroad access in this territory will be worth 3 times what it is worth right now within 5 years of the line being laid." Rebecca sat very still. "How certain is that survey?" "Certain enough that Caldwell has been buying land along the probable corridor for 2 years, he said. "Certain enough that the offer he authorized me to make you is generous by drought standards, but a fraction of what this land could be worth in a few years' time." He looked up at her then. "If you can hold on." "If I can hold on," she repeated. She got up from the table and went to the window, looking out at the dark yard. The stars over Texas at night were something else, dense and brilliant, indifferent to the troubles of the people beneath them. "That is the question, is it not, Mr. Wells? I have $140 in savings. I have 15 head of cattle that are mostly surviving on feed I am buying on credit. I have a well that may or may not last through a second summer of drought, and you are telling me to hold on." "I am telling you what I know," he said quietly. "I am not telling you what to do. That is yours to decide." She turned back from the window. "Why are you telling me this at all?" "You work for the Caldwell Company." He was quiet for a moment. "Not anymore," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and set a folded document on the table. "That is my commission contract. I wrote my resignation letter on the road this afternoon. I have not got anywhere to send it yet, but I am done with the work." She stared at the folded paper. "You quit your employment before you even arrived here." "I quit it on the road," he confirmed. "I told you I kept stopping." "The last time I stopped, I got off my horse and sat in the dirt for 15 minutes and thought about my grandfather, and thought about the other people I had been sent to speak with over the last 3 weeks. And I decided I would rather be broke and honest than employed and useful to a company that was getting rich off desperate people." Rebecca Carver looked at Isaiah Wells across the table her father had built, in the house her father had built, on the land her father had loved, and she felt something shift in her, not quickly or dramatically, but the way the ground shifts after rain, settling into something that was more solid than it had been before. "You are a peculiar man, Mr. Wells," she said. "I have been told that," he said. "Where will you go when you leave here?" He looked at her steadily. "I do not entirely know," he said. "I have not worked that out yet. I thought I would figure out the right thing to do first and worry about the rest afterward." She nodded slowly. She took the commission contract from the table and put it back in front of him. "Take that with you," she said, "when you find somewhere to send it." He took it and put it back in his pocket, and there was something in the small ordinariness of that gesture that made her chest feel strange in a way she decided not to examine too closely. Isaiah Wells did not leave that night. He asked if he could sleep in the barn, and she said yes, because it was dark and a long ride back to anything, and she told herself it was simple practicality and tried not to think about how quiet the house had been for the last 8 months without her father in it. In the morning, she was up before the sun to tend to the remaining cattle and the 2 horses she kept. She was coming out of the barn when she found Isaiah already there, having watered and fed his mare and moved on to haul water to the cattle trough from the cistern. He had taken off his coat and rolled up his sleeves and was working with the concentration and economy of motion of someone who was used to physical work. "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She stood and watched him for a moment. He worked well, she noticed. He worked without the self-conscious performance of a man trying to impress. He just worked. "Are you a rancher?" she asked. "I was," he said, setting down the water bucket and stretching his back. "My family had land in New Mexico territory. We lost it 6 years ago to a land dispute, the kind where one man has money and lawyers and the other just has the land." He looked at the horizon, which was already beginning to glow with the first suggestion of sunlight. "I spent a few years doing whatever work came along after that. Cattle drives, some carpentry, a season working for a surveying crew. Then the land company job found me and I told myself it was honest work." He paused. "I told myself that for about 2 months. And then you came here," she said. "And then I came here," he agreed. They had breakfast together again, eggs from the 3 hens she still kept, and more of the coffee she rationed carefully. The morning light came through the east window and fell across the table, and outside the world was baked and pale and inhospitable, and inside there was the smell of coffee and the sound of 2 people learning how to be in the same space. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what you told me last night. About the railroad survey." He looked up at her over his coffee. "I need to know how reliable that information is," she said. "Not the rumor, the actual survey, whether there are documents, a filed route, anything that could tell me whether holding this land through another summer of drought is a reasonable gamble or a foolish one." "I know the name of the surveying company," he said. "They did work for the railroad out of Fort Worth. If there is a filed route, it would be with the land office in Amarillo." He paused. "I could go and find out." "Why would you do that?" she said. "You have no obligation to me." He met her eyes across the table. "I told you what I know about that survey because I thought you deserved to have the same information the Caldwell Company has," he said. "If I can help make sure that information is real and not just a story someone told to justify their land buying, then it seems like the thing to do." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. The morning sun made his face look softer than it had yesterday, less like a man who had ridden in on company business, and more like something else she was not yet ready to name. "I want to come with you," she said. "I cannot leave the animals for more than a day, but if we ride in together tomorrow and come back the same evening, the animals will be fine." He considered this. "That is a full day's ride there and back." "I know the road," she said. "I have been making it since I was 12 years old." The corner of his mouth lifted again. "All right, Miss Carver," he said. "Rebecca," she said, and then looked slightly surprised at herself. "If we are going to spend a full day riding to Amarillo and back, you may as well call me Rebecca." He said her name once slowly, as though he were getting the measure of it. "Rebecca, then Isaiah." She spent the rest of that day showing him the property. She was not sure why she did it, except that she wanted him to see what she was fighting for. She showed him the main pasture where her father had planted grass seed 3 years running before he got a stand to take. She showed him the kitchen garden that she was keeping alive by hand, carrying water from the cistern in buckets each morning, 4 buckets per trip, enough to keep the tomato plants and the bean vines from dying outright. She showed him the creek bed, the dry ghost of what had once been a cheerful running water that she had played beside as a child, its banks still green in her memory even as the reality was dust and cracked clay. He walked beside her and listened, and when she pointed things out he asked real questions, the kind that showed he was actually thinking about what she was telling him. He asked about the soil composition and the depth of the cistern, and whether the water level had been dropping or holding steady. He noticed the way the land dipped slightly to the north and said something about topography and water table that she did not fully understand, but that sounded like it might matter. "You know land," she said. "I grew up on it," he said simply. "And then I lost it, and I spent a long time after that reading everything I could about why land fails and what it takes to bring it back. It is like, when something is taken from you, you want to understand it completely, even if that understanding comes too late to help." She understood that. She understood it down in her bones. That evening she found him in the barn working on a section of fence rail that had rotted at the base and was leaning dangerously against the barn wall. He had found her father's tools, the good ones, the ones she kept hung and oiled out of habit, and was fitting a new length of wood that he had cut from the stack of planks behind the barn. "Those were my father's tools," she said. He paused. "I should have asked before I touched them. I am sorry." "No," she said, and she was surprised to find she meant it. "It is all right. He would have liked to see them being used." She leaned against the barn door and watched him work. He had a saying. He said, "A tool sitting idle is just metal and wood waiting to rust and rot. A tool in a working hand is what it was made for." Isaiah glanced at her with something warm in his eyes. "Your father sounds like a man who understood the purpose of things." "He did," she said softly. She made supper again, and they sat together at the kitchen table as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Two people who had met under the strangest circumstances, finding the rhythm of eating together, talking easily, the constraint of the first day already loosening into something more comfortable. She told him about growing up on the Carver property, about learning to ride before she could properly read, about the years after her mother died when it had been just her and her father and the land, and how those years had been hard, and also, in some ways, the richest of her life. He told her about New Mexico territory, about the ranch that had been his family's for a generation, about riding the high desert country as a young man, and thinking that nothing in the world was as beautiful as land that tested you and gave in return. He told her about the land dispute, more carefully, the way a man tells a story he has rehearsed into flatness to survive the telling. A larger rancher had wanted their water rights. He had found lawyers and ways. The Wells family had lost in court, and then lost in practice when the new owner ran their stock off the land they could no longer legally claim. "Where is your family now?" she asked. "My mother lives with my sister in Santa Fe," he said. "My brother took a job with the railroad, which he finds ironic given everything." He looked at the table. "My father died the year after we lost the ranch. He was not an old man. He just ran out of reason to go on." The silence after that held weight. Rebecca reached across the table and put her hand on his briefly, and he looked down at it and then at her, and something passed between them in that look that was too large and too fragile to be handled yet. She withdrew her hand. He turned his coffee cup. "We should sleep," she said. "It is a long ride tomorrow." They left before sunrise, the sky ahead of them still dark gray, and the air carrying the brief, false coolness that came before the sun remembered what it was doing. Rebecca rode her good horse, a chestnut mare named Clara who was steady and reliable, and Isaiah rode his bay, and they rode side by side through the empty country toward Amarillo. The land they rode through told a story of drought's damage, empty farmsteads with their windows staring blank as eyes, herds reduced to skeleton numbers standing in bare pastures, a water tank beside the road that had cracked open from the pressure of its own emptiness. The Texas Panhandle in the summer of 1886 looked like a place that had been wrung out and left to dry, and the people still in it were holding on by whatever they could find to hold. They talked as they rode. The conversation was easy in the way of conversations between people who have already passed through several layers of careful civility and arrived somewhere more honest. She told him about the community at Holt Creek, the small, tight-knit collection of ranchers and farmers, and the one general store that served as the social center of the territory. She told him about her friend Martha Prout, whose family had sold and moved east, and how the absence of Martha felt like a new kind of drought, the drought of familiar company. He told her about the cattle drives he had worked, the long months moving herds up from Texas into Kansas, the brotherhood and hardship and occasional violence of it. He told it well, the way of someone who had lived it without romanticizing it. He described the dust and the exhaustion and the river crossings, and the towns at trail end with the worn humor of a man who has long since made peace with difficult memories. "You have had a life of constant movement," she observed. "I have," he said. "I have been moving for 6 years since the ranch. I keep thinking one of the places I arrive at will feel like the place I am supposed to be." He paused, looking ahead at the road. "I have not found it yet." She did not say anything to that, but she thought about it for most of the remaining ride. Amarillo in 1886 was a rough, busy cattle town, not yet the settled city it would become, but animated with the commerce and noise of a place at the center of a great deal of movement and money. They tied their horses at the rail before the land office, a long, low building near the courthouse, and went inside. The land office clerk was a small, precise man with spectacles who regarded them with the mild suspicion that government clerks reserved for anyone who came to look at documents rather than file them. Isaiah explained what they needed: any filed route documents for the Fort Worth and Denver City Railway Extension Survey, with a calm directness that suggested he had spent time around official processes. The clerk went into the back, and Rebecca and Isaiah stood together at the counter. She was aware of how close they were standing, their arms nearly touching, and she did not move away. The clerk came back with a ledger and 2 rolled documents, and he spread them on the counter with the resigned air of a man who did not love sharing information but was obliged to do it. The survey documents were real and recent. The proposed route came within 4 miles of the Carver property's eastern boundary. The projected date for route finalization was 18 months away. Rebecca looked at the maps for a long time without speaking. "This is real," she said finally, quietly. "Yes," Isaiah said. She straightened. "Then I need to hold on for 18 months, she said. "Maybe a bit longer for the line to actually begin returning value to the surrounding land, but I am close enough to the route that the effect will be felt." "You will need water," he said practically, "or a solution to the water problem. The cistern will not last indefinitely." "I know," she said. She was thinking, hard and practically, the way her father had taught her to think about problems straight at them, not around them. They ate a quick lunch at the small restaurant on the main street before riding back, and over the meal they talked about the water problem with a focus and seriousness that felt like partnership. Isaiah knew about well drilling, having worked a season with a crew. He thought there might be a deeper water source below the current well if she could afford to drill deeper. He knew something about dry land farming techniques that had been developed for low water conditions. He talked about catching and storing rainwater from the barn and house roofs, which seemed inadequate against the scale of the drought, but was better than nothing. She listened to all of it, and she was struck again by the quality of his attention, the way he treated her water problem as a genuine problem to be solved rather than an insurmountable obstacle or an argument for selling. "You have thought about this kind of thing a great deal," she said. "I have thought about what I would do if I had land again," he said. "I have had 6 years to think about it." He looked at her across the table. "I did not expect to be thinking about it for someone else's land." She held his look. "And yet here you are." "And yet here I am," he agreed. On the ride home, the sun long past its peak but still fierce, they passed the old Dunbar farmstead, empty now, its house still standing but its windows already beginning to fill with wind-blown dust. Rebecca pulled up her horse in front of it without really meaning to. "This was the Patterson family before the Dunbars," she said. 3 generations on that land. The children who grew up here moved to Dallas last year." She looked at the empty windows. "The Caldwell Company owns it now." Isaiah pulled up beside her and they sat together looking at the empty farmstead in the afternoon heat. "I am sorry I was part of this," he said. Not directed at her, not defensive, just said. A reckoning with himself in a few words. She turned to look at him. The sun was behind him and he was half in shadow, and she thought, this is a man trying hard to be good in circumstances that do not always make that easy. She thought about what that took and she felt the respect of it. You stopped, she said. Before you got to my gate, you stopped. That is not nothing. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully classify, something between gratitude and something more than gratitude. They rode the rest of the way in a companionable quiet that she found she did not want to disturb. Back at the Carver property, with the horses seen to and the evening chores done, they sat on the porch as the darkness came in. The stars over the panhandle were magnificent, as they always were, burning white in the navy sky, and the air had finally cooled enough to be bearable. What will you do, she asked him, now that you are not working for Caldwell? I have some money saved, he said. Not a great deal, enough for a few months if I am careful. He leaned forward on the bench, elbows on knees, looking at the sky. I have been thinking about what I said earlier, about well drilling. I know a man in Holt Creek, a fellow named Gus Haber, who owns a drilling rig. I could see if he has work, or I could offer to help with the drilling in exchange for doing it at a reduced rate for you. He glanced at her sideways. If that is something you would want. She studied his profile in the dark. You are talking about staying, she said. I am talking about being useful while I figure out what comes next, he said carefully. Isaiah, she said, and she heard the way his given name sounded in her own voice, and it sounded like something she had been saying for years. Are you sure you want to take on someone else's troubles when you have enough of your own? He turned to look at her then fully, and in the starlight his expression was unguarded in a way it had not been during the day. I am not entirely sure of a great many things, he said honestly, but I find that I am sure about being here. I am not sure I can explain that well yet. She looked back at him. The porch was not very wide and they were sitting close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm. She did not do that. But she was aware of the distance and of what it meant that she was thinking about it. You can sleep in the barn again, she said softly. Thank you, he said. And in the morning, she said, you can tell me more about this well drilling idea. He was already smiling slowly as she went inside. The following week moved in a way that Rebecca could not have predicted. Isaiah stayed. He did not announce it with any formality. He simply was present each morning when she rose to do the chores, and they worked together through the days with an efficiency that grew naturally from two people who were both capable and who found each other's company easier with each passing day. He went to Holt Creek and spoke with Gus Haber about the drilling rig. Gus was a large, laconic German immigrant who had come to the Panhandle with ambitions for farming that the land had redirected into drilling and machinery repair, and he agreed to bring the rig out to the Carver property in exchange for Isaiah working 3 weeks on his own land after the drilling was done. Rebecca contributed what she could from her savings toward the equipment costs. The drilling took 4 days. It was loud and dirty work, the rig clanking and shuddering as it drove down through the cracked earth, and Isaiah worked on it alongside Gus and Gus's 2 hired men with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, and Rebecca brought water and food and watched the work with the focused anxiety of someone whose whole future rode on what they found below the surface. On the 4th day in the late afternoon, they found water. Good water, deep and cool, more reliable than the upper well. Gus estimated it would serve the property through any normal drought, and probably through one as severe as this one. Rebecca stood at the edge of the drilling site when they confirmed the flow and felt something come loose in her chest that had been wound very tight for a very long time. Isaiah came to stand beside her. He was covered in dust and grease, and he looked tired and satisfied in the way of a man who has done hard work and has something to show for it. He looked at the water coming up from the new well, and then he looked at her, and she was crying, just quietly, 2 lines of tears on her dusty face. And he did not say anything, but he reached over and took her hand, and she let him. They stood there like that, hand in hand beside the new well, and Gus pretended to be very interested in adjusting some part of his equipment, and his 2 hired men suddenly found urgent business in the other direction. When she had herself together, she squeezed his hand once and then released it, and she wiped her face with her apron. "Thank you," she said. It was nowhere near sufficient for what she meant, but it was what she had. "Your father would have been glad," he said, and that made the tears threaten again, so she turned away and walked back toward the house, and Isaiah let her have the moment to herself. That evening was different from the ones before. The water had changed something, had shifted the weight of the situation from precarious survival toward genuine possibility, and there was a lightness between them at supper that had not been there before. They laughed more. She told him a story about her father trying to teach a notoriously contrary mule to do its job, and the mule's various creative solutions to the problem, and Isaiah laughed with real delight, and told her a story about a cattle drive incident that involved a runaway steer, a river, and a very surprised family of settlers. And she laughed until the tension of the last months felt genuinely distant for the first time. They sat on the porch afterward, as was their habit now, and the night was warm and the stars were out, and Rebecca was aware of a change in herself, something that had been opening gradually over the past days, completing its opening, like a door swinging wide on a room she had not known was there. "Isaiah," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. The lantern light from inside the house came through the window and caught the line of his jaw and the directness of his eyes. "When you said you were not sure you could explain why you are here," she said, "is it any clearer now?" He was quiet for a moment. The night sounds of the panhandle surrounded them, the distant call of a night bird, the soft shifting of the horses in the barn, the vast breathing silence of the land. "Yes," he said, "I think it is clearer." "Will you tell me?" she asked softly. He turned more fully toward her. "I think I stayed because I needed to know you would be all right," he said. "And then I stayed because I found that I did not want to leave. And now I am staying because this is the only place I have been in 6 years where I wake up in the morning and feel like I am in the right place." He paused. "I know that is a great deal to say to a woman I have known for 2 weeks." "It is," she agreed. Her voice was very steady, which surprised her because she did not feel steady at all. "I am also saying," he continued carefully, as though weighing each word, "that I understand this is your land and your life, and I am not here to impose myself on either. What I am is honest with you, because I told you at the beginning that I would be." Rebecca looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father, who had loved a woman and built her a house and a farm and a life, and who had never once, in all the years she had watched him, been anything other than steady. She thought about the 8 months she had spent alone in this house since his death, the silence and the grief, and the stubborn solitary fighting of a battle that was too large for one person. She thought about the moment 2 weeks ago when a man had ridden in through her gate under the worst possible pretense, and then proved to be something else entirely. "Isaiah," she said, "I am not going to tell you that I have been waiting for you, because I have not been the sort of woman who waits for men to arrive and solve things. But I will tell you that since you arrived, I have felt less alone than I have felt in years, and that is a considerable thing to say." He reached out then and touched her face, his hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that seemed at odds with a man who could haul well-drilling equipment all day, and she turned her face into his palm slightly, just slightly, and they stayed like that for a moment in the warm dark. "I would like very much to court you properly," he said, "if you will allow that." She searched his face. "Are you going to stay in this territory to do it?" "If you will have me in it," he said. "Yes." She covered his hand with hers. "Then yes," she said, "I will allow it." He kissed her then, carefully, once, the kind of kiss that makes very large promises without saying anything at all, and she kissed him back, and the stars over Texas burned on in their brilliant, indifferent way, and the land below them, parched and cracked and fighting, kept its patient faith with the people who refused to leave it. In the days that followed, something in the dynamic between them remained practically the same. They still worked the property together, still ate their meals at the kitchen table, still sat on the porch in the evenings, but it was all different in the way that the same music played in a different key is recognizably itself, but entirely transformed. There was a warmth in their exchanges now that had not been there before, small touches and meaningful looks, and the particular richness of conversation between people who have decided to know each other fully. He began to tell her things he had not told anyone in a long time. The full story of losing the New Mexico ranch, the legal machinations of it, the particular humiliation of being dispossessed by processes that claimed to be just while producing obvious injustice. She listened to all of it without flinching, and she spoke plainly about the same kind of injustice she had witnessed in the Panhandle, the way that power and money had a way of tilting the game against the people who had nothing but their land and their labor. They were both children of the land in its full, brutal, beautiful reality, people who had seen what the country could do to those who lacked protection, and talking about it honestly between them made something strong. She began telling him things she had not said aloud since her father died. The grief of it, the specific loneliness of a single person managing a large property without help, the nights she had sat at this table and wondered whether she was being brave or simply stubborn to a fault. He listened with the quality of attention she had noticed from the beginning, full and genuine, and he never minimized what she said or tried to fix it with optimism. One evening, about 3 weeks after his arrival, he came to supper with his expression carrying something new, a careful, serious look that she recognized as the look of a man who has made a decision and is about to say it. "I went to Holt Creek today," he said as she poured the coffee. "I know. You told me you were going to settle your arrangement with Gus Haber." "I did that," he said. "I also stopped in at the Assier's office." He paused. "There is a small piece of property, 20 acres, on the east side of Holt Creek. It has a cabin and a well, and it is in poor repair but structurally sound. It is for sale at a price I can afford." He looked at her. "I want to buy it." She set the coffee pot down and looked at him. "You want to settle here," she said. "I want to be in this territory," he said carefully. "I want to have a proper place of my own so that I am not imposing myself. So that when I court you it is as a man with something of his own to offer and not as someone living in your barn." She was quiet for a moment, thinking about this. "You have not been imposing yourself," she said. "You have been helping me considerably." "I know," he said, "but I want to be here as a man, not as a temporary hand. I want to buy that property and fix it up and do honest work and be in this county when the railroad comes through and things change." He met her eyes across the table. "I want to be here, near you, in whatever form is right and proper." She studied him for a long moment. 20 acres is not much," she said practically. "No," he agreed. "But it is mine and it is a start." She thought of her father, arriving in this territory in 1869 with a wagon load of tools and a determination to build something. She thought about what it meant that Isaiah Wells, at 32 years old, wanted to plant himself in the earth of the Texas Panhandle after 6 years of rootless, purposeless movement. "Buy it," she said. He looked at her as though he wanted to be sure. "You are certain?" "Isaiah," she said, "I have been certain about very little in the last year. I am certain about this." He bought the property 2 days later, and from then on he divided his time between his own land and hers, which in practice meant he was at her place most of the day and went back to his cabin to sleep, a situation that was thoroughly respectable and thoroughly unsatisfying, and they both knew it, and they were both patient about it in the way of people who have decided to do something properly. The weeks accumulated. August's brutal heat finally began to give a fraction in September. There were 2 small rainstorms, nothing like enough to break the drought, but enough to give the kitchen garden a real drink and turn a few things green again. With the new deep well, the cattle were watered properly for the first time in months, and Rebecca began to see them recovering, putting weight back on, moving with something closer to their normal energy. She and Isaiah were seen together frequently enough in Holt Creek that the community understood, with the pragmatic social intelligence of a small town, what the situation was. Martha Pruitt's mother, who had stayed behind when Martha left, cornered Rebecca outside the general store one afternoon and asked, with the directness of a woman past the age of tactfulness, whether that Wells man was going to make an honest woman of her. "He is courting me properly, Mrs. Prout," Rebecca said with great patience. "I can see that," Mrs. Prout said. "I am asking when he is going to finish courting and get to the point." Rebecca went home and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand in her bedroom and tried not to smile. In October, he asked her to marry him. He did it on the porch in the evening, as all their most important conversations had happened, in the dark with the stars out, because that was their place, that porch and that sky, and it was exactly where they had first sat together and said honest things to each other. He did not have a ring, which he apologized for with a seriousness that she found very touching. "I will have one," he said. "When I next get to Amarillo, I want you to know the absence of it right now is not Isaiah," she said. "Stop talking." He stopped. "Yes," she said. He stared at her. "I have not actually asked the question yet," he said. "You were about to." "I was." "The answer is yes," she said, and she took his hands in hers and held them, and he looked at her with an expression that was too full for words, which she appreciated because she was not sure she had words either. They were married in November of 1886, on a bright cold day when the sky had finally turned properly blue again, after the summer's washed-out pallor. The ceremony was at the small church in Holt Creek, performed by the Reverend Thomas Adkins, who had been the community's minister for 15 years and who spoke about drought and renewal with a warmth that suggested he understood both the literal and the metaphorical dimensions of what he was witnessing. Mrs. Prout was there and cried. Gus Haber was there, enormous and clean in his Sunday clothes, beaming with the satisfied expression of a man who felt he had played a small part in a good outcome. A dozen neighbors from the surrounding land were there, most of them people who had stayed and fought and were still holding on, and there was something in the gathering of them that felt like a statement. Rebecca wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her, cream and ivory and worn with the dignity of something kept carefully for a reason. Isaiah wore his good coat, brushed and pressed, and he watched her walk toward him down the church aisle with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. The way a man looks when he cannot believe his good fortune and has decided not to hide it. After the ceremony, they had dinner at the church hall, the community contributing what they could, which was modest by the standards of better times but felt abundant in the warmth of the company, and there was fiddle music and dancing on the worn wooden floor, and Rebecca danced with her husband, which was a thing she had not expected to be able to say when the year had begun. They went home to the Carver property that night. His 20 acres would remain his, a resource and a foothold, but they both understood without having to discuss it at length that their life together would be built on the land her father had built. He had come to it without a transaction, and that was exactly right. The first winter of their marriage was cold but manageable, and the deep well held true, and the cattle came through the season in better condition than the previous year. Isaiah applied himself to the property with the energy and knowledge of someone who had been thinking about what he would do if he had land to work for 6 long years of waiting. He was innovative without being reckless, practical without being rigid, and his particular mix of carpentry skills, ranching knowledge, and the surveying experience he had accumulated combined into a formidable competence that the Carver property had needed badly. He rebuilt the barn properly, a month of serious labor with lumber hauled from Amarillo, and the result was something her father would have admired, square and solid, and made to last. He worked on the kitchen garden with her through the winter planning, ordering seeds for the spring that were suited to dry conditions, learning from a Mexican rancher south of Holt Creek about growing techniques that used water more efficiently. He fixed the front gate, which had been hanging crookedly since before her father died, a small thing but one that made her stop and look at it every time she passed. He mailed his resignation letter to the Caldwell Land Company in January. They sent a brief, cold acknowledgement. He showed it to Rebecca and they both found it oddly satisfying. In February, a writer came from Amarillo with a message for Isaiah. Rebecca was hanging washing when he came out of the house with the letter and an expression she could not read. "What is it?" she asked. "My brother," he said. "Daniel, he wants to come out and spend some time. He has left the railroad job." He looked at her. "Is that all right?" I told him. I described the property and the situation. "He is good with horses. He could be useful." "Is he like you?" she asked. "Daniel is better than me in several ways," Isaiah said, "and worse in a few others. But he is honest and he works hard, and he has been adrift since the family lost the ranch, the same as I was." "Write to him," she said. "Tell him he is welcome." Daniel Wells arrived in March, younger than Isaiah by 4 years, and if Isaiah was reserved and thoughtful, Daniel was open and immediately warm, a man who made friends the way water found its level, naturally and without effort. He was useful with the horses as promised, and he integrated himself into the life of the property with the ease of someone who had been looking for exactly this kind of belonging. He also, within 2 weeks of arriving, managed to find himself on the receiving end of considerable attention from a young woman named Clara Haber, Gus's daughter, who came over with her father when Gus came to look at a problem with the drilling equipment. Clara was 21 and direct, and entirely unimpressed by male posturing, and Daniel was utterly taken with her from the first afternoon, which Rebecca and Isaiah both observed with poorly concealed amusement. "Your brother has good taste," Rebecca said to Isaiah that evening. "He has always had good taste," Isaiah said. "He just has not always had the sense to act on it sensibly." He looked at her sideways. "I will speak to him about being appropriate." "You," Rebecca said, "who showed up at my property on a fraudulent errand and then quit your job on the road and slept in my barn for a week before I knew your last name, you are going to counsel your brother about appropriate behavior." Isaiah considered this for a moment. "Yes," he said, with great dignity. She laughed out loud, which was a sound that the Carver property was getting more familiar with these days. The spring of 1887 brought rain. Not a downpour, not the dramatic end of the drought all at once, but a series of proper rains over several weeks that began to ease the cracked earth and put water back into the depleted streams. The creek on the Carver property began to run again in April, just a trickle at first, and Rebecca stood beside it and watched the water moving over the dry stones with her hand over her mouth. Isaiah came to stand behind her and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned into him and watched the water run. "Hello," she said to the creek. He held her tighter. By May, with the rains continuing their slow, reliable work, the pasture began to green, and the kitchen garden flourished, and the cattle grew fat and purposeful. Isaiah had brought in 2 additional breeding pairs in the early spring, a calculated risk that was beginning to pay. He and Daniel had repaired most of the fencing, which meant the herd could be managed properly for the first time in years. The community at Holt Creek began to feel the turning as well. Several families who had stayed through the drought found themselves coming through it into something better. There was a collective exhale, a loosening of the held-tight anxiety that had been the tone of the territory for 2 years. In June, Rebecca told Isaiah she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, early morning, before the day's work began. She was direct about it because she was a direct person and because she was not given to preamble, and he stood very still for a moment looking at her as though he needed to be sure he had heard correctly. "Rebecca," he said. "I know," she said. "The timing is perfect," he said. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her. "The timing is perfect. We have water and grass and a solid barn and a ranch that is coming back. The timing is exactly right." She covered his hands with hers. "You are sure?" "I have never been more sure of anything," he said. He was like that about it all summer, attentive and delighted without being hovering or anxious, which was exactly the balance she needed. He took on more of the heavy work without making a production of it. He fixed the bedroom floor, which had had a soft spot for years, and built a cradle with her father's tools and her father's lumber, and the making of it occupied his evenings for most of July and August, and the result was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen him build. Daniel married Clara Haber in September of 1887, a small ceremony in the Holt Creek Church, and the gathering felt like the community holding a celebration for itself as much as for the couple, two young people choosing to stay and build in a territory that had asked a great deal of everyone who remained in it. Gus Haber was so pleased about the marriage that he brought a barrel of his good beer to the reception and stood beside it all evening looking like a man who had accomplished something personally significant. The railroad route was finalized in the fall of 1887, and it came as Isaiah had predicted it would. The eastern boundary of the Carver property was 4 miles from the nearest planned station. The effect on land values in the area was almost immediate. Prospective buyers and investors began to move into the territory, inquiring about properties. Isaiah tracked all of this carefully and kept Rebecca informed, and they agreed together that they would not sell, not now, not the land itself, but that there might be opportunities in the changes coming that they could navigate advantageously. On a cold December night, their son was born. Rebecca had not had an easy time of it, and Isaiah spent 11 hours in a state of barely controlled terror that he would not admit to anyone, but that was visible in the set of his jaw and the controlled violence with which he had split nearly half a cord of firewood in the afternoon. Mrs. Adkins, the Reverend's wife and the community's de facto midwife, was inside with Rebecca, and Isaiah and Daniel sat on the porch in the cold and did not speak much and waited. When Mrs. Adkins opened the door and told him he had a healthy son and a wife who was tired but well, Isaiah stood up from the bench so fast he knocked it over and was inside the house before he had any conscious awareness of moving. Rebecca was propped against the pillows with the newborn in her arms, and she looked exhausted in a way that frightened him and radiant in a way that stopped his heart. She looked up when he came in, and the expression on her face was not tired at all. "Come and see your son," she said softly. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the infant in her arms, red-faced and blinking and furious with existence in the particular way of the newly arrived. "He looks cross," Isaiah said. "He will settle," Rebecca said. "He just needs a moment." "He looks like your father," Isaiah said, and he did not entirely know why he said that, but it felt right, and Rebecca's eyes filled with tears and she blinked them away and looked at the baby. "I want to name him Thomas," she said. "Thomas Carver Wells." Isaiah looked at her. "For your father. And because it is a good solid name," she said. "A name that belongs to a man who will stand up." "Thomas Carver Wells," Isaiah said. The name settled in the cold air of the room like something being written down. "Yes." He took his son in his arms carefully, with the hands of a man who had built and repaired and hauled things all his life but found himself terrified of this particular weight, and he held the boy and felt the full impossible truth of his life come together in a single moment. The land outside with its water and its green winter grass, the woman beside him with her steady gaze and her extraordinary stubbornness, this child who was both of them and neither of them, a third thing entirely. The years that followed were the years of building. Isaiah was tireless in the practical expansion of what the Carver property had been into what the Wells Ranch became. He acquired more cattle as the market improved. He brought in sheep the second year, a decision that raised a few eyebrows in a cattle-first community but proved wise when the wool prices held strong through a period when beef prices dropped. He and Daniel worked land that had been fallow, bringing it back with careful water management and the dry farming techniques they had learned and adapted. Rebecca ran the domestic economy of the property with the same intelligence she had applied to surviving the drought, keeping careful accounts, making strategic decisions about what they grew for their own use and what they bought, building a kitchen garden so productive that she began trading surplus vegetables and preserves in Holt Creek, and then selling them on a small but regular basis. She was the kind of woman who improved everything she put her hands to, and she put her hands to everything. Daniel and Clara moved into a proper house on the far end of the property, built by Isaiah and Daniel together over the winter of 1888, and the two families created the kind of close compound living that had been common in the old ranch country. separate but deeply connected, sharing labor and resources, and the occasional evening meal that extended long past dark with talking. Thomas grew from the red-faced, indignant newborn into a serious, curious boy who had his father's eyes and his mother's jaw, and a particular quiet tenacity that was recognizably both of them. He followed Isaiah everywhere from the time he could walk, interested in everything, watching how things worked with the concentrated attention of a child who intends to understand the world rather than simply move through it. In 1890, Rebecca gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Eliza after Isaiah's mother, who had made the journey from Santa Fe to meet her grandchildren, a visit that produced a week of lively conversation between two women who were both strong-minded and highly capable, and who recognized each other immediately and completely. Eliza Wells the elder went home to Santa Fe shining with something that looked very much like relief, as if she had needed to see her eldest son settled and whole before she could be fully at peace. Daniel and Clara had a son of their own that same year, a round, cheerful boy named George, and the two cousins grew up together on the land with the ease of children who have always had companions and who do not know anything different. By 1892, the Carver land her father had filed on in 1869 had become the Wells Ranch in the wider community's understanding, though Rebecca kept her father's name on the deed as a second name for the property and always would. The railroad had brought the changes Isaiah had predicted. Holt Creek had grown, a second general store and a proper hotel, and a schoolhouse that Rebecca had been one of the loudest advocates for, attending every community meeting that concerned it and speaking with the directness that everyone in the territory had come to expect from her. Thomas started school at 6 and absorbed everything the schoolteacher, a young man from Ohio named Mr. Crawford, had to offer, and exhausted it within 2 years. Rebecca wrote to a school in Amarillo about correspondence courses and supplementary materials, and set Thomas up at the kitchen table with a curriculum that she and Isaiah monitored together in the evenings. Isaiah relearning alongside his son the mathematics he had neglected, and Rebecca finding, with some pleasure, that she had more learning already in her than she had known. One evening in the autumn of 1892, Rebecca and Isaiah sat on the porch as they had done on uncountable evenings since the beginning, the stars out and brilliant, the sounds of the night ranch around them, a dog barking somewhere and the cattle shifting, and the wind moving through the recovered cottonwoods along the creek that now ran reliably and well. Thomas was asleep inside. Eliza, at 2, was asleep. The ranch house around them was solid and well kept, every plank and peg of it familiar. Isaiah reached over and took her hand. He did that still, as though 6 years of marriage had not made it automatic but kept it conscious, a choice he made each time. "Do you remember," he said, "what you said to me the first day I rode up? I told you I was not selling," she said. "You did," he said, with considerable conviction. "I had considerable conviction," she said. "I still do. And I told you." He paused. "You said you had not really come to buy," she said softly. She looked at him. "I thought about that for a long time afterward, what you meant by it." "I meant that the job I had been given was to buy your land," he said. "But I think even then, on the road, stopping and starting, something in me already knew that the reason I could not ride away and stop thinking about it was not about the land at all." She turned to look at him fully. The lantern light inside the house came through the window and touched the silver that had begun to appear at his temples, which she privately thought suited him enormously, and his face in the near dark was exactly the face she knew best in the world. "What was it about?" she asked, though she knew. "You," he said simply. "The woman who would not give up her land, the woman who would not be moved. I did not know that yet. I could not have known it. But I think some part of me recognized, even then, that this was where I was supposed to be." He looked out at the land, at the dark shapes of the cottonwoods against the star-bright sky. "Not because of the land, because of you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The night held them as it had held them since the beginning, patient and enormous and full of stars. "I told you I was not selling," she said quietly. "Yes," he said, "and you told me you had not really come to buy." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Below them, the creek she could hear running in the dark, water moving over stone, the sound of something that had returned and would not leave again. "What had you come to find?" she asked. He pressed his lips briefly to the top of her head. "This," he said, "all of this, I just did not know it yet." She closed her eyes and felt the warm, substantial weight of his arm around her, the familiar sounds of the ranch, the presence of her children sleeping inside, the presence of the land all around, the land her father had built and that she had refused to surrender and that had become, in the fighting for it, something larger than what it had been before. Thomas came out the front door in his night clothes, blinking, having woken from a dream. He was 6 years old and solemn as an old man, and he looked at his parents sitting together on the porch bench, and then came and inserted himself between them with the comfortable presumption of a child who has never had reason to doubt his welcome. "It is cold," he said. "Then you should be in bed," Rebecca said, but she pulled him in close on her side. "I had a dream about the creek," he said, "that it ran backward." "Creeks do not run backward," Isaiah said. "I know," Thomas said with the satisfied tone of a boy who has a good question ready. "But what if they did? Where would the water go?" Isaiah considered this seriously, as he always did with Thomas's questions. "I suppose it would go back to where it started," he said. Thomas thought about this. "Where do creeks start?" "Up in the hills, mostly," Isaiah said. "From rain and snowmelt and underground water that finds its way out. And where does it go at the end?" "To a river, usually," Isaiah said, "and rivers go to the sea." Thomas processed this for a moment, staring at the dark sky. "So the water goes all the way from the hill to the sea," he said. "Most of it," Isaiah said. "And then it rains again," Thomas said, "and starts over." "Yes," Isaiah said. Thomas seemed satisfied by this. He leaned against his mother's side and was silent for a while, and then his breathing slowed into the deepness of sleep, and Rebecca looked at Isaiah over their son's head with an expression that was happiness in its fullest and most complicated form, the kind that knows exactly what it cost. Isaiah met her eyes and held them. She had thought, on the day he rode in through her gate, that she was looking at an adversary. She had not been wrong, exactly, and she had not been right either. She had been looking at the other half of something that was still in the process of becoming itself. She looked out at the land her father had built. She looked at the water moving in the dark creek. She felt her son sleeping against her and her husband's arm steady at her back and her daughter inside the house and the whole living enterprise of the Wells Ranch around her, repaired and rebuilt and green again, proof against drought, proof against the companies and their agents, proof against the particular cruelty of a country that pushed hard against the people who tried to make something honest in it. She would not sell. She never had. And the man who had not really come to buy was still here, 6 years on, his arm around her in the dark, as fixed and certain as the land beneath them. In the spring of 1893, the cottonwoods along the creek stood thick with new leaves, brilliant green against the blue sky, rustling in the clean, warm wind that came off the flat country from the south, and Rebecca walked the length of the creek with Eliza on her hip and Thomas running ahead of them, and she stopped at the place where the water ran deepest and clearest, and she stood there for a long time, listening to it. Isaiah found her there when he rode back from the south pasture. He swung down from the horse and came to stand beside her, and he looked at the water and then at her. "Good water," he said. "Good water," she agreed. He took Eliza from her hip, which his daughter accepted with a pleased expression that confirmed her preference for being carried high. Thomas came splashing back from where he had gone upstream, his boots thoroughly wet, and Rebecca sighed with the practiced patience of a mother who has accepted that dry boots on a 6-year-old boy near running water is an aspirational concept. They walked back to the house together in the afternoon light, the four of them, through the land that was theirs, that had always been going to be theirs, that the drought had tried to take and the land companies had tried to purchase, and that none of it had been able to move, because Rebecca Carver had stood on her porch and said she was not selling, and the man who had come to buy her out had looked at her across the cracked yard and found that he had not really come to buy at all. He had come home. He had just not known it yet. He knew it now, with a certainty that was as deep and reliable as the water underground, as steady as the land under his feet, as clear and bright and permanent as the woman walking beside him through the green spring air of the Texas Panhandle, in the year of 1893, on a ranch that would stand long past all of them and remember, in its stones and its soil and its deep good water, the stubbornness and the love it had been built on.